Jerusalem, AD 30. It was Friday of Passover. The sun had only just begun to touch the slope of the Mount of Olives, but the city was already boiling. This was not an ordinary morning. Pilgrims had poured in from everywhere: Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, Rome. The roads, already crowded, were now compressed to the point of suffocation. The air thickened. Sacrificial smoke drifted over the rooftops. The smell of roasted lamb mixed with the smell of sweat, dust, and animals. The voices of those selling sacrificial offerings rang out from the corners of the market. The bleating of sheep pressed together inside temporary pens. The clinking of silver striking the money changers' tables did not stop. All of it took place under the cold gaze of the Antonia fortress. From above, Roman soldiers watched every movement below in the temple courts. Pilate did not come here from Caesarea just to observe the feast as a ritual. He brought military force with him because he was afraid. Because Passover was not only a religious day, it was the memory of a people who had once escaped the yoke of slavery. It was the memory of the day an empire was defeated. In every empire fears memories like that. Jerusalem that morning was living in two rhythms at once. On the surface was worship. Underneath was tension. On the surface was ritual. Underneath was the fear of eruption. In that very city, trembling between faith and fear, a man was walking toward death. But what happened that day was not only an execution, it was a direct collision between religion, politics, and imperial power. And everything did not begin in the morning. It began the night before, in an olive garden called Gethsemane. By this time, it was already midnight on Thursday. In an olive garden called Gethsemane, at the foot of the Mount of Olives, Jesus was praying. The Gospels record one very weighty detail. He fell into a state of extreme agony. Luke writes, "And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground." Luke 22, verse 44. That was not a way of speaking for emphasis. Medicine has a term for this phenomenon: hemodidresis. This is a very rare condition, occurring when psychological pressure is pushed to the point that tiny capillaries rupture, blood mixes with sweat and seeps out through the skin. In other words, before the scourge touched his back, his body had already begun to react to the pressure of that hour. The point that must be faced directly here is this: Jesus did not enter that night in uncertainty. He knew very clearly what was coming: betrayed, arrested, dragged away in the night, humiliated, put on trial, scourged, crucified. Everything was before him. He said to the disciples, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me." Matthew 26, verse 38. But they could not go all the way through that stretch with him. They slept. While he was praying under ultimate pressure, those closest to him could not stay awake. That night began with loneliness. Then it shifted very quickly into betrayal. The darkness in the garden was torn open by torchlight. A crowd came straight into Gethsemane. Judas was leading the way. He did not come alone. With him was a group of armed men. There were temple guards. There were men carrying clubs. There were men carrying swords. This detail is very striking. The one they came to seize was an unarmed rabbi. But the way they stormed into the garden was like they were moving to suppress a major threat. Judas had already prepared a signal: "Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him." Matthew 26, verse 48. Then he stepped forward. "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Matthew 26, verse 49.
That whole night is wrapped up in that detail. A kiss, a sign of identification, a gesture that should have been of closeness, now opening the way for the arrest. From here, the story changes color completely. This was no longer the hour of prayer in the garden. This was the opening point of the manhunt. John records it very briefly. Then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. John 18, verse 12. From the moment the ropes tightened around his hands, that night no longer belonged to Gethsemane. It belonged to the machinery that was preparing to crush him, one stage at a time.
After being arrested, Jesus was dragged away immediately in the night. Jerusalem at that hour was almost empty. Torchlight cut through the cold stone streets. The ropes were still on his hands. The first stop was the house of Annas. He no longer held the office of high priest, but his influence was still there. The temple, order, power, profit, everything was tied to names like his. A few days earlier, the Lord had overturned the money changers' tables in the temple. He had struck the place where people made money under the name of worship. From that point on, this story was no longer simply about them being offended by his teaching. It touched something far more sensitive. Annas questioned him about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered directly, "I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together, and I said nothing in secret." As soon as he finished speaking, one of those standing nearby struck him in the face. That night opened like that. Questioning, then a slap across the face of a bound man. It did not stop there. They took him to the house of Caiaphas. The religious leadership had already gathered there. And those who had laid hold of Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. The machinery began to close in. They looked for testimony, not to know the truth, to have grounds enough to kill. Matthew writes very plainly, "Now the chief priests, the elders, and all the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death." Many statements were brought forward. They did not match. They were not enough. Then Caiaphas asked directly at the point they needed most, "Are you the Christ, the Son of God?" The Lord answered, "It is as you said." That was the moment they seized what they wanted. Caiaphas tore his robes. The room exploded. From here, the trial no longer needed to preserve the appearance of fairness. They turned to humiliation. Then they spat in his face and beat him, and others struck him with the palms of their hands. The night was still not over. Pilate had not yet appeared. The cross was still ahead, but the Lord's face had already been spat upon, had already been struck, had already been humiliated in a room full of men acting in the name of God. At daybreak, they would hand him over to the Roman authorities. As soon as day broke, they brought Jesus to Pilate. Outside, Jerusalem had grown noisy again. Those going to the feast crowded into the streets. The smoke of sacrifice rose again. And while the city was entering the morning of Passover, the Son of God was being dragged away like a criminal. They stopped outside. They did not go in. John records it very clearly. They themselves did not enter the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate came out and asked. Then the question came out, "Are you the king of the Jews?" That was the point where this case changed color. That title struck directly at Roman power. Pilate saw the problem very quickly. He did not want to carry this case. When he heard that Jesus was from Galilee, he pushed him over to Herod.
Herod was glad because he was curious. He wanted to see a spectacle. He wanted to see a miracle. He wanted to watch the man who had shaken the whole city perform in front of him. But Jesus did not give him that. He remained silent. That silence made Herod even more bitter. Then Herod, with his men of war, treated him with contempt and mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. That meant Jesus was turned into a spectacle right before the soldiers' eyes, looked at as a false king, laughed at to his face, passed back and forth like an annoying object no one wanted to keep. Then he was brought back again to Pilate. The sentence was still there. Pilate tried another route. During the feast, there was a custom to release one prisoner. He put forward two names, Barabbas and Jesus. Barabbas was the kind of man who robbed, murdered, and was involved in insurrection. And Jesus stood there after an entire night of being dragged around, humiliated, and made into a laughingstock. Pilate thought the people would choose Jesus. He was wrong. The crowd shouted, "Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas." Then that cry rose even higher, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" In the middle of that shouting, Pilate asked the second question, "What then shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ?" From below came the answer at once, "Let him be crucified." Pilate asked again, "Why? What evil has he done?" The crowd did not answer that question. They only wanted blood. Let him be crucified. At this point, everything was enough. The leaders wanted him erased. The crowd wanted to see him crushed. Herod had already finished humiliating him. Pilate was the one who placed the final seal. Mark closes it very coldly. So Pilate, wanting to gratify the crowd, released Barabbas to them, and he delivered Jesus, after he had scourged him, to be crucified. From that moment on, the Lord was no longer being passed from room to room. He was fully handed over into the soldiers' hands. The morning of trial ended there. The morning of execution began there. From that moment on, the Lord was thrown straight into the hands of the soldiers. This was what Rome did best: break a man, crush his strength, humiliate him before killing him. They dragged him into the courtyard, closed in around him, looked like wolves staring at prey already bound. Then the torture began. Not a few blows meant to intimidate, not a few strikes just to get the procedure over with. Rome had something made for this very purpose: a whip with many leather thongs. At the ends were pieces of bone, pieces of metal, things made to tear flesh open when they struck and were ripped back. Each lash did not stop at pain. It bit into the body. It hooked. It tore back. It made a man collapse even while still on his feet. The Lord's back took it all. The Lord's shoulders took it all. His strength fell away in waves. The soldiers had no need for mercy. The weaker they saw him become, the more eager they grew. The more they saw that body start to give way, the more they wanted to press further. The purpose was very clear: wear him down, make his legs tremble, make his breathing break apart, keep going until by the time he stepped out of that courtyard, his body had almost been drained of all living strengths. But the torture was still not enough for those men. They also wanted to laugh over his pain. They stripped him, put a purple robe on him, a cheap mockery, a filthy humiliation. Here is your king. Then they twisted together a crown of thorns. Not soft branches, hard thorns, sharp, long, pressed straight down onto his head. That pain did not stay in the skin of the scalp. It drove into his forehead, into his eyes, into his face. Blood began to run out. Then they shoved a reed into his hand, knelt before him. Their mouths shouted false honor, their eyes were full of contempt. The whole crowd turned the Son of God into entertainment in the middle of the soldiers' court. But they did not stop there. They spat in his face. Then they took the very reed they had put into his hand and beat him on the head with it. Every blow drove the crown of thorns deeper. Every blow sent another surge of agony across his face. Every blow poured another layer of humiliation over a body already brutalized. That was the cruelty of empire when it no longer saw the person in front of it as a human being. Beating was not enough. They had to laugh. Causing pain was not enough. They had to humiliate. Breaking the body was not enough. They had to force the spirit to collapse with it. The Lord stood in the middle of that circle and took every act of evil. Behind him were the lashes. On his head were the thorns. On his face were spit, blood, and the contempt of an entire pack of soldiers. The whole night before had already been heavy enough. Betrayal, ropes, a slap across the face, spitting, punches, blows. Morning came, and it grew even heavier. Torture, humiliation, mockery. His body turned into a spectacle before men who were used to living by violence. Then, when they had laughed enough, they took the purple robe off him, put his own clothes back on him, not because they were moved. The next part had arrived. The wood was waiting. The road to execution was waiting. Golgotha was waiting. And the Lord walked out of that courtyard with a body beaten to the very limit.
Coming out of the soldiers' courtyard, the Lord was pushed straight into the next stage. The soldiers threw the wooden beam onto his shoulders. That beam pressed directly onto the back that had just been torn open by the scourge, pressed onto shoulders already ripped open, pressed onto a body that had been crushed all night. The crown of thorns was still driven deep into his head. Blood was still running down his face. Now look directly at that scene. A back torn apart, a great deal of blood already lost, a crown of thorns driven deep into the head, and on his shoulders a heavy wooden beam pressing directly onto open wounds. From the place of judgment to Golgotha, that road became a prolonged execution. His shoulders bent down, his legs staggered. Every step seemed to drain the last remaining strength from the Lord's body. He tried to walk. Then he fell. He could no longer hold himself up. That body had been pushed to its limit. The soldiers saw it immediately. They needed him alive until Golgotha. The crucifixion had to take place there, in broad daylight, before the eyes of the crowd. So they seized a man passing by, a foreigner. His name was Simon, a man of Cyrene. They forced him to carry the wood for the Lord, and the Lord was driven on behind in a condition almost completely drained of strength. Golgotha was now before them, and the most terrible part was still waiting there. They arrived. They threw him onto the wood. His hands were stretched out. His feet were forced into place. The nails were not driven through the palms of the hands. That place could not hold the full weight of a man. The Roman soldiers knew that very well. They used nails about 13 to 18 centimeters long, driving them straight into the wrists, into the very part of the bone strong enough to suspend a human being on the wood. At the feet, the nail was driven through as well, fastening him to the upright beam. That pain was enough to make the whole body convulse. But that still was not the most horrifying part. The cross did not kill with the first blow. The cross killed by prolonged suffocation. The body hung downward, the chest was pulled tight. Breath became trapped. To draw another breath, the Lord had to push up with his feet and lift his body. To lift himself, he had to force his strength directly onto the places that had just been pierced by nails. The back, already torn open, scraped directly against the rough wood. Then the body dropped down.
Then came choking again. Then he had to force himself up again. Pain upon pain, suffocation upon suffocation, until all strength was drained away.
On the cross, the Lord still spoke. The final words came out in the midst of pain, in the midst of suffocation, while his body had already been crushed to the very end. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. They nailed him to the cross. He asked the Father to forgive them. Beside him, a condemned criminal was also waiting to die. Today you will be with me in paradise. In the middle of the execution, the Lord still opened the door of salvation for a man who was about to breathe his last. At the foot of the cross, his mother was standing there. She could not pull him down. She could not stop the nails. She could not stop death. And the Lord said, "Woman, behold your son. Behold your mother." His body was hanging there in pain, yet his eyes still looked down at his mother. Then the cry broke out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That was no longer an ordinary voice. It was a sound torn out from the very bottom of pain. That cry made the whole hill of Golgotha grow heavy. Too much blood had already been lost. The body had already been hanging too long. The throat was burning dry. And the Lord said, "I thirst." Only 2 words, but those 2 words came out of a body that had been drained almost empty. Then the final sentence came. Not faint, not weak, not broken off halfway. It is finished. After that sentence, heaven and earth were about to change. The temple was about to shake, and the people standing beneath the cross were about to see this death was not the end of everything. Then he bowed his head and breathed his last. At that very moment, according to the book of Matthew, the veil in the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. That veil separated the most holy place from the rest of the temple. It was about 18 meters high, woven from thick linen. To hang it in place required many priests. If that veil was truly torn, it was no small thing. It was a terrifying tear in the very center of the holiest place of worship. A boundary had been ripped wide open. And right at the foot of the cross, in the middle of blood, in the middle of wood, in the middle of the body that had just breathed its last, a voice broke out. Not from a disciple, not from a priest, not from the crowd, but from the mouth of a Roman soldier. Truly, this was the Son of God. By that point, from the outside, everything looked finished. The Lord had breathed his last. The cross was still standing in broad daylight. The leaders had gotten what they wanted. Pilate had kept order. Rome had finished its public display of warning. By the custom of empire, a body would usually be left hanging on the wood, for the sun to scorch, for birds to tear at it, for anyone passing by to see it and be afraid. Killing was not enough. Death had to keep speaking on behalf of power. But at that very moment, a man stepped forward. Joseph, a man from Arimathea, a man of status, a man who had long remained hidden in the shadows. He went straight to Pilate to ask for the Lord's body. That was not a small thing. To ask for the body of a man who had just been executed as one who stood against Roman order was, in itself, a risky step. Pilate was surprised that the Lord had died so soon. He had it checked. A Roman soldier took a spear and drove it straight into his side. Scripture records it very clearly. Immediately, blood and water came out. That was the final confirmation that the Lord had truly died. Only after that was his body taken down. At that point, everyone thought the story had already closed. An innocent man had been crushed. A machine of power had won completely. An execution had come to an end. But that very place turned everything over. The cross had been raised to humiliate.
Later, it became a sign people would never forget. The death had been arranged to silence a voice. Later, that voice would sink even deeper into history. The leaders thought they had removed a threat. Pilots thought the matter was settled. The crowd thought they had finished watching. Rome thought it had finished teaching a lesson about fear. But from that wood, everything began to turn in another direction. They were able to kill the Lord's body. They were not able to stop what would come after.
After going through this whole story, what stays with me is not only how painfully the Lord was crucified, but the real choking weight of seeing him pushed to the very limit and still not change. People betrayed him. People spat in his face. People dragged him from one room to another. People beat him, put a crown of thorns on him, forced him to carry the wood, nailed him to it, and then still stood at the foot of the cross mocking him. Reading that, I feel pain in a very real place. The Lord knew everything, saw everything, and still went all the way. He did not avoid it. He did not pull back. He did not turn away. The more I think about it, the more I feel that it is hard for me to live the same way as before. Because if I truly believe that the Lord endured all of that for me, then I cannot just believe casually, love casually, and then live in such a way that when I need him, I remember him, and when it is convenient, I pass him by. To me, this story does not only make me feel sorrow for the Lord, it also makes me ashamed. Ashamed because many times my mouth says I love the Lord, but the way I live is still far too shallow. And that is also exactly why it pulls me back to a place of being more serious about my faith. If you believe the Lord endured all of that for you, leave a comment. Lord, please keep me near the cross.